Left of the box. So yes, this next part is going to be content warning-ish. There's going to be racist imagery, racist language. But it is an overview of, yes, this is what Canada is. It's always what Canada has been. Tori, the lefty Canadian radical, she's a trusted source on Twitter. She has lots of good information. She's a woman of color, so has to deal with a lot of racism online on a regular basis, but she always has a lot of facts and stuff to go to, especially when it comes to policies and government and stuff. So if you're still on the hostile farts, Hannah, give her a follow. Well worth it, and you'll learn a lot. So she's responding to the idea that Canada was never racist, a short thread. In 1890, Vancouver City Council supported B.T. Rogers' efforts to establish a sugar refinery in the city, provided he did not employ any Chinese. And this is the advertisement for that back then. So here, like white labor, what shall it be? So pretty much promoting it as like, this is a better company because we have white labor here. And this is again in reply to Pierre Poilievre and Jordan Peterson saying racism was invented in Canada and imported when Canada became woke. But this country was built on it. So Canada never had a racist problem until recently. And that part, so the first sentences there are in sarcasm. Le Canada, Montreal, August 25th, 1900. And that is a pretty disturbing image. So let's see if this is, it's about immigration. Shifton, here's a fine lot of immigrants that I got for practically nothing, Miss Canada. So Shifton is this person, Miss Canada, her. My God, how much will it cost me to send them back? Electors, elections, provincial British Columbia, 1907. No Chinese, Japanese, Hindu, or Indian shall have his name placed on the register of voters for any electoral district or be entitled to vote at any election. So this was actually put into law. And then just breaking down using a not appropriate term these days for referring to somebody who is Chinese. And the thing is that we've had laws around elections and who can and cannot vote for quite some time. And I believe it wasn't even until the 1960s before all Indigenous peoples could vote. I believe it was that late. So come down to the Miss Burlington's Bluebird Inn in Vancouver. They have white sheets. And so this was the business card from 1920. And it says home cooking, white help only. BC Saturday Sunset, Vancouver, August 10th, 1907. A typical home of a Vancouver white working man. A warren on Carroll Street infested by 2,000 Chinese. So again, that's from 1907. Nothing racist about these Canadian wages. Pacific Coast Mine Limited report of the minister's mines, 1911. And so here we have white miners up here, number of employees, average daily wages, and we have Japanese, Chinese, Indians, and as you go down, so let's see, average daily wage here. So we have $5, $3, and then we go down to this group here. So then it's $2.20 and $1.75 for these groups down here. Despite dark skin, he has a white heart. Totally not racist. Canadian Patriotic Fund poster in 1960. 16. Oh, right. They're referring to Indigenous peoples here. I'm thinking India. Sorry about that. I'm not going to read out what's on that. You can see it yourself. Part of it says, pale face, my skin is dark, but my heart is white. For I also give to Canadian Patriotic Fund. Couple of bros being bros. Edmonton Mayor Dan Knott pictured in 1931 Ku Klux Klan Convention, Royal Canadian Legion Memorial Hall, March 25th, 1931. There was a large population of KKK members here in Canada. It's some areas were just, yeah, my area included actually, used to be a bit of a hub back in the 80s, I believe. How our Ukrainian diaspora drew Black people was not racist either. I'm not going to read that, but this is a poster in Ukrainian in 1925. I'm just going to quickly scooch past this one. I think you kind of got the gist of it. Indians, a constant pearl, so said the RBC, not racist. The Royal Bank of Canada, ad 1926. Perils have not passed. When the white man came lurking, people in constant peril, although the years have passed since, then there's still those who prey upon the fortunes of the unsuspecting and uninformed. Without protection of modern banking facilities, you invite misfortune. Care not for a victory bond poster from Archive of Ontario in 1942. Again, I'm just going to scooch past the picture of this one. You'll get it. Just the Chamber of Commerce unracistly opposing people of different races coming together in solidarity in the labor movement. Luncheon Bulletin, Vancouver Chamber of Commerce, 1950. You can see that for yourself. I'm not going to describe it or read anything on that one. So that was just a small sampling. And here, yeah, no history of 200 years of slavery, abolished only 30 years before the USA. Followed by segregation, the Indian Act, internment of Japanese, Chinese, head taxes, bans on immigration of undesirable races, residential schools, sterilizing Indigenous women, and the 60 scoops, etc. And a lot of that hasn't stopped. The way this government treats Indigenous peoples, it's still absolutely horrific what's going on. So racism has always been a part of Canada. Jay Hunter just saying, referencing again that racism didn't exist here until recent decades, as Pierre Poilievre says. So John A. MacDonald, the execution of Indians ought to convince the red man that the right man governs. Residential schools, Chinese head tax, Japanese internment camps, KKK, neo-Nazi groups, etc. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents who are... I don't even like reading. That's the thing. I don't even like reading this. You can see it on the screen there, what it says. And though he may not learn to read, write, in his habits and training mode of thought are Indian, he is simply who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself as head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. And a Ku Klux gathering in Kingston, Ontario, on July 31st, 1927. The Canadian Knights of Ku Klux Klan. Not surprisingly, the Canadian starts with K. Just a reminder that Doug Ford's daughter started an online bakery business that was called Kai Kai's Cookies. And the acronym for that was KKK. She spelled cookies with a K in Kai Kai. So it's KK Cookies. KKK. But, she didn't know any better. It was a cutesy little name. She thought it was just a cutesy little, like, alliteration type thing. So they hold a meeting in Vancouver on October 30th in 1925. History lessons on dealing with Canada's neo-Nazi groups. Canada has long been home to hate groups, and two moments in 1938 and 1965 show how best to handle today's strain. Here we have some people's personal experiences with racism in this country. This is Christopher E. Richardson. My parents in HS in the early 60s in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, went to Dartmouth High, so in high school. The thing to do then was to drive out to Preston in the back of pickup trucks and hit black people walking on the sides of the road with a broom. It had a name, In the 80s, we had KKK distributing flyers at Cole Harbour High newly opened and being the high school in traditionally black Creighton becoming just a junior high school. And this is the article, how the 1989 Cole Harbor high brawls opened eyes and ears to race relations. The brawls that highlighted the racial divides in the community began with a snowball fight. And this article is from 2019. It's been 30 years since two brawls broke out in Cole Harbor District High School. The fights on January 9th, 1989, and the day after brought the Nova Scotia school into the national spotlight because the animosity broke down along community and racial lines. One of the sides of the fights were students from mostly white coastal communities of Eastern Passage and Cow Bay. The other side were students from a largely black communities of North Preston, East Preston, and Cherry Brook. I think we do not need to talk about what happened back then, just so that we can get a perspective as to what happened, why it happened, so that history doesn't repeat itself, says Archie Beals, who served on Nova Scotia's Provincial Advisory Council Education. Beals, who graduated from the school in 1986, was also part of the Parent-Student Association of Preston that was formed in the wake of the fights. So anyhow, no idea what world PP thinks we live in. He lives in. Oops, typo, but yeah. But racism has always been a thing in Canada, and woke recent decades didn't start it. And here we have a Black Search for a History in Nova Scotia, published in 1984 from the New York Times. So Terrell Tailfeathers, racism didn't exist in Canada before decades. Canada in 1876, the Indian Act. A person means an individual other than an Indian. The Indian Act is still in use to this day. It's been modified over the years, but it's still a thing in Canada. This still actually exists in Canada. The Serfs pointing out Canada was a colonial project that forced Indigenous people into reserves and stole their children from their mothers legally under the Indian Act of 1876 to suggest racism is a new concept because woke is both ahistorical and asinine. White supremacists love revisionism. So somebody else just talking about their personal experience. I don't know how to say that name at all. Okay, listen, I don't normally wade into political discussions, nor do I like to get into arguments about whether or not people are racist, but I'll make an exception for this. Two white guys talking about whether Canada was or wasn't racist before is hilarious. As a kid, I was called a fucking... You can see it on the screen. Growing up, I've listened to people make rude comments about friends of varying races, accents, food, clothing, and the list goes on. My wife is still shocked at the number of openly curious, bordering on judgmental comments she gets around our mixed children that go to something like, they clearly aren't fully white. What are they? What background is their father? I still like to occasionally reminisce about a certain bank whose manager of the private wealth division told me to my face he ignored my email because of my last name and only returned the voicemail I left because I didn't have an accent. They're lost, and I plan on making sure they feel that loss. So to Jordan and Pierre, you are welcome to argue about whether the pendulum has swung too far or whether the policies are working, but to argue that people were race blind and that everyone was on equal footing before that is laughable. So somebody else's personal experience, don't know how to say the name, sorry about that. Growing up in Toronto in the early 70s, as I walked to school every morning, I would daily experience racist slurs shouted at me from random people on the streets. It was like a sport to them. I was a child and they were much older teens. We didn't import racism. It's homegrown. Excuse me, what? And another person, visually better on Twitter, just again, personal experience. Born and raised in small town Alberta, I can tell you it was extremely common 40 years ago for people I knew to use the term, you can see them on the screen, etc. Racism has always been here. I won't even go into terms used for First Nations. So here we have racial segregation in Canada, and this is from Wikipedia. Until 1965, racial segregation in schools, stores, and most aspects of public life existed legally in Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, and informally in other provinces such as British Columbia. Unlike in the United States, racial segregation in Canada applied to all non-whites and was historically enforced through laws, court decisions, and social norms with a closed immigration system that barred virtually all non-whites from immigrating until 1962. Section 38 of the 1910 Immigration Act permitted the government to prohibit the entry of immigrants belonging to any race deemed unsuited to the climate or requirements of Canada, or of immigrants of any specific class, occupation, or character. Medical segregation. Indigenous peoples of Canada were treated in racially segregated hospitals called Indian hospitals, or segregated wards in regular hospitals. Medical examination also occurred at these hospitals, frequently without consent, such as testing of BCG vaccine on infants. These hospitals were underfunded, overcrowded, and had worse quality of care for patients. Hospitals that exclusively treated white patients were often located nearby. Also, there was the forced sterilization of Indigenous peoples. Blood transfusions were segregated based on donors' race until the 1960s in both the United States and Canada. Blood from Black individuals was perceived as inferior and unsafe for use in white recipients. Charles R. Drew advocated against the practice due to a lack of scientific evidence. Also, I'm pretty sure that Jordan Peterson and Pierre Poilievre are familiar with money. They like money, so I'm pretty sure that at any given time, they have money on them, including our funny money, our funny-looking money, our colorful money. The very monopoly-like, types of money. And we have a $10 bill here in Canada. And a little while ago, they get updated from time to time, the images, the color, and stuff like that. And we got a $10 bill not too long ago featuring Viola. I think that's how you say her name. Yeah. So, and this bill was also interesting because it was vertical as opposed to horizontal. But whenever there's a new design in our currency, there's a lot of detail put into it. And she was picked for a reason. So, courage and dignity. Viola Desmond was a successful Black businesswoman who was jailed, convicted, and fined for defiantly refusing to leave a whites-only area of a movie theater in 1946. Her court case was an inspiration for the pursuit of racial equality across Canada. Viola's story is part of a permanent collection of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. Yeah, that happened. That was a thing. Again, more segregation type stuff in this country. But, and it's ongoing to today. From CP24 News, arrest made and charges laid after alleged hate-motivated incident in Waterloo region. Toronto, police say they have arrested and charged a suspect in connection to an alleged hate-motivated incident in Waterloo region. Waterloo region police say officers responded to reports of disturbance at a residential building on King Street North near Eglin Street around 1:40 p.m. I don't need time and street type thing. Anyway, investigators say they determined that an unknown male approached the victim and began throwing racial and derogatory slurs at them. They say the victim was being followed throughout the building by the suspect as he uttered threats before he fled the area. Police say no injuries were reported. The 34-year-old suspect, who was arrested Saturday, is facing multiple charges, including criminal harassment, uttering threats to cause bodily harm or death, and possession of stolen property. Bail hearing and whatnot. Hate crimes have been on the rise here in Canada. A lot of race-based, the largest increase has been towards the queer community. But it has been on the rise, and a lot of it has to do with the rhetoric that Pierre Poilievre and Jordan Peterson spread. It has to do with them stoking the flames. It has to do with them, calling it wokeism and bringing attention to it and fear-mongering to their base and telling their base that it's all the other people's problems. And then even the Liberal Party is at fault because, they turned around and threw immigrants under the bus when they said, oh yeah, the housing crisis, it's the immigrants. That's where it's coming from, as opposed to, all the policies they put in place that caused it. There's a thing called birth alerts. And if you don't know what that means, you're a little bit sheltered. In Canada, in a lot of areas, to be honest, I don't know if it's still going on. It wouldn't surprise me. It was basically whenever an Indigenous person gave birth, an alert would go out to Child Protective Services. And it used to be the case oftentimes where at that time they would force the person to consent to being sterilized or have their child taken away. And there were stories of that as late as 2018. There was a big race riot in Toronto, actually. Yeah, the Christie Pitts riot. Come to think of it. So the Christie Pitts riot occurred on August 16th, 1933 in the Christie Pitts playground in Toronto, Ontario. The riot can be understood in the context of the Great Depression, anti-Semitism, swastika clubs and parades, and resentment of foreigners in Toronto, and the rise of Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. Let's just scooch down to the riot. So this is just the background. The riot, which lasted 6 hours, broke out after a corner-file baseball game at Christie Pitts between two local clubs, consisting predominantly of Jewish and Italian players, and St. Peter's baseball team, sponsored by that church at Bathurst and Bloor. The night of the riot was second game. After the final out, the second game, the members displayed a blanket with a large swastika painted on it. A number of Jewish boys and young men who had heard about the previous swastika incident rushed the swastika sign to destroy it. Supporters of both sides, including Italians who supported the Jews from the surrounding areas, joined the fight, and a fight started. The Toronto Daily Star described the events the next day. While groups of Jewish and Gentile youths wielded fists and clubs in a series of violent scrapes for possession of a white flag bearing a swastika symbol at Willowvale Park last night, a crowd of more than 10,000 citizens. It was big. It was big. A crowd of more than 10,000 citizens, excited by cries of Heil Hitler, became suddenly in a disorderly mob and surged wildly about the park and surrounding streets, trying to gain a view of the actual combatants, which soon developed in violence and intensity of racial fleeing into one of the worst free falls ever seen in the city. Scores were injured, many requiring medical and hospital attention. Heads were opened, eyes blackened, and bodies thumped and battered as literally dozens of persons, young or old, many of them non-combatant spectators, were injured more or less seriously by a variety of ugly weapons and hands of wild-eyed and irresponsible young hoodlums, both Jewish and Gentile.